So next, I'm pleased to introduce to you Congressman David Schweikert. He is a steadfast supporter of the blockchain industry, and he is the co-chair of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus. As co-chair, Congressman Schweikert has facilitated 2 blockchain workshops. One was exploring digital identities with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which we heard about yesterday. And another was just 2 weeks ago discussing payments in his home state of Arizona. Congressman Schweikert has an in-depth knowledge of the vast potential of this technology. He's one of our key champions in Washington, D.C., and he does this so eloquently time and time again while holding his signature cup of coffee. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Schweikert.
Hey, have you ever, who else has also done sort of these sort of things where you come and about to speak to a group and you're trying to figure out what your opening line was going to be? Do I have anyone here that does crypto mining? Okay. One of the reasons I love you is you're going to be my canary in the mine for when there's actually quantum computing. Now, for everyone that didn't get that joke, I want you to turn to the person who raised their hand and have him break your heart. I know you've done a lot of things, and I know the majority of this audience actually is sort of around the financial space, some of the crypto space. I want to actually sort of throw a number of things at you. I co-chair the Blockchain Caucus. I'm actually, one of my only claims to fame is just about 2011, when you were seeing some of the early articles about blockchain. I was sitting in a subcommittee with a guy named Ron Paul, and trying to explain to then Chairman Paul what it would happen if there was a digital currency. No one had any idea what I was talking about. Today, I can't pick up a newspaper without everyone telling me what they think about it. So, but I want to actually take us a little bit sideways. There are so many opportunities, and I know you're working on some identity, so let's actually sort of take place of a thought experiment we were doing with my state legislature just about a month ago. I actually had a bunch of my state legislators in Arizona, and we were actually, I took the big whiteboard and I was walking them through the concept, what would happen if our Department of Motor Vehicles held all bills of sales? So it's your boat, it's your motorhome, it's your car, it's the tractor on a distributive ledger. And we actually walked through every problem you can come up with. We actually had a brilliant young man who is a programmer walk us through the idea of what would you take so you're a new vehicle moving into Arizona. Take the phone, do a video around it, take a snap of the VIN number, get a functionally a token with it, put it on the chain. The ability to have the liens attached to it. What would happen, who here has ever stood in line at their motor vehicle department? And now the concept, look, I'm hunting for sort of the unified theory of how do I start to go from every asset I own, from my car to my university transcripts to my personal health records, which we're going to come back to because that's one of my absolute fixations, to everything I have and have it be secure, but also sort of where, for some of the folks here who are freaky smart, to work through what are the levels of permission. Because we were having the discussion on, okay, what if someone was successful in trying to register a car that was stolen in another state? Who's your arbiter? Is there certain mechanisms? And I was trying to coin a phrase with them saying, okay, you could have a keymaster, which is a high-level permission when there's actually a way to adjudicate that type of problem. But just this concept of how much easier would my life be that every 2 years I don't have to stand in line to register my vehicle, or if I buy a vehicle from out of state. And there's lots of examples like this where you may have incredible difficulty explaining how a cryptocurrency moves and is accepted and has its value and borrow off of it and pledge it to your Thanksgiving dinner. But it's easy to sort of explain saying, I'm going to make it so you don't have to stand in line at the MVD. So if you sort of walk through, my sort of utopian or techno-utopian view of the world, I think there's states like Arizona that are ready to sort of leap As you know, a couple of years ago, we put in a couple pieces of legislation as part of the Arizona Commercial Code to actually have things like smart contracts, accepting parts of a distributive ledger. Now I need some folks to start showing up and saying, here's our proposal. So we've all sat through and had the discussions over and over what you do with land title. I actually think it may feel safer to do something like the bills of sales and those, because in the land title, we still have to sort of work out an agreement amongst the smart people and those of us in sort of the policy side of, is there a way to have a node network where part of the nodes actually have a certification to them, or an insurance wrapper, those things. Who was here last year? Okay. Another one of the thought experiments. In Arizona right now, we have lots and lots of autonomous vehicles, running around our streets. We're trying very hard to be very, very friendly. Many folks heard this, but I'm still waiting for someone to show up with it. You're moving down the street, and the autonomous Volvo in Tempe, Arizona takes a left-hand turn and hits you. Who do you sue? Everyone. Yep. Well, okay, I have a lawyer in the office. No, but the fact of the matter is, dealing with tort liability issues is one of the great barriers, because the lawyers need to eat. They typically are eating everything I have, but you sue the code, right? Code is what told it to take the left-hand turn. What makes the code insurable? Hold the code in a distributive ledger. So if someone who's really smart decides they're going to go alter the code and say, no, I wasn't, can you play in a distributive ledger without leaving a thumbprint? Well, it turns out this same sort of idea of I can make code insurable, so now my autonomous drone, my autonomous truck, my autonomous vehicle, all I can ensure that it makes code insurable. It was that same protection of you can't alter the code. We actually tried to do a piece of legislation for what was going on at the VA, where we had people stepping in and altering the scheduling of veterans. And yet there was no audit trail to go back and find out how those schedules how veterans were disappearing from the scheduling system, so people would have a certain level of efficiency of seeing veterans, so therefore they were getting their bonuses. You all see the punchline there. It would be really easy. Just move that scheduling system onto a distributive ledger, and you'd see every time someone went in and was altering or touching it. So start to think it. So there's so many applications here that if you start to unify the mechanisms, it solves a lot of my societal problems, a lot of my sort of, instead, in the VA example, I think they stepped up and were trying to spend $70-some million in a new scheduling software. Who here for $70 million would be willing to fix that problem for me? I mean, hell, I was ready to go do it. And look, I used to code in SQL with VB front end, so I'm like a dinosaur. But you start to realize it's not that hard. It's just trying to figure out where the unintended consequences, where are the threats, where have you dealt with permission levels and those things. A couple other things from sitting on the Ways and Means Committee. We will work through, and you heard from the commissioner, what was it, yesterday afternoon? The discussion, the court ruling that also happened yesterday, commodity currency, those things. Should we actually try to move to a single regulator so that we don't have a scope or jurisdiction war coming between the SEC and those who do commodities and those things? Can you actually legislatively put in a sort of principle-based rules with a big sandbox around it? The reality of it is somewhere here we're going to have to deal with this, because as investors on the crypto side start becoming more mainstream, I think actually a lot of that mainstream of our population are going to actually sort of want to know Is it still the Wild West? Which, being from Arizona, I'm more comfortable with the Wild West. But we all know that adoption is going to want some guardrails. I'm one of those who's always nervous the guardrails impair growth and creativity. So we're going to need some smart people to also help us make sure that those of us on the policy side, particularly the tax side, don't screw it up. I'm also an outlier. I know there's some arguments of, well, how do you tax the values, those things? We actually have 100 years of history of how do you tax people that trade foreign exchange. If you do a quick thought experiment of at the point, if you're sitting at an FX desk, at that moment when you're trading back and forth and pledging and doing hedges, is it a currency or a commodity? Now, once you close your book, you can cash it in and go spend it, and then it's a currency. The fact of the matter is, we don't have to reinvent the wheel from top to bottom. We actually do have case law and some tradition and IRS rules to at least to think about that are out there for those things. Okay, medical records. Do I have anyone here that was at the Capitol with us last May when we brought in MIT, NIST, some of the others to try to think about, okay, was it a good meeting? And then the paper that came from NIST after, that if you wanted to hit a certain level of encryption standards and those things, turns out in our society right now, we all know about HIPAA. But did you know for education records, there's something that's every bit as strict and carries personal liability? Turns out we also have certain types of privacy standards for financial records, where if you as the holder of them carry personal liability. The ability to have NIST write their paper and say, look, here's an encryption standard we feel comfortable with, and we're hoping that many will start to look to coding. I actually wish they'd put a little more tokenization discussion in their paper, but that's only a personal fixation I have. So, the ability to start having that supercomputer you carry around in your pocket, that phone, should that be holding your medical records? Okay, last January, being the brain trust I am, I tried chopping my finger off. So you're bleeding out in the emergency room on a Sunday evening. Where are your medical records when you're bleeding out in the emergency room on a Sunday evening going, pinky bleeding? And he's asking you, well, what are you allergic to? And you're busy going, bleeding. The fact of the matter, it's absurd, sort of, when you just think about it, that we have electronic medical records, except we, as a society, have them sitting in the doctor's office and not portable with us. Because if you start to think about it, there's a revolution also coming right now on wearables. There's a unified theory coming here. Has anyone ever seen the little YouTube video of the contact lens that actually does blood glucose? That talks to your phone, that talks to the pump. Start thinking about the patch that I'm a severe asthmatic, the patch I could be wearing that manages my blood oxygen, that tells me saying, David, please go take another puff of an inhaled steroid. Well, how do you intend to hold all that data on top of your medical records, on top of the transmission to the algorithm that's going to also be talking to your phone, that's going to be talking to the AI or the algorithm, that you're going to come home and showing up on hopefully the flying drone, that the insurance is covered by, never mind, with your new pharmaceutical. This entire sort of infrastructure of very, very personal data, of a financial transaction, of a documentation. Do you sort of see, for a lot of us, I'm desperate to try to get all these ideas and say they're all wonderful. Can I get them on rails that are safe, have appropriate levels of permission for that particular item, and I can get them all in one place? Because, and then let's do some questions. It's the weird frictions we've sort of created in society where over here, the brain trust of my brothers and sisters in Congress, we told Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all these, that we need you to start blinding Social Security numbers, so make up numbers. So now when grandma walks in, she's going to have 3 or 4 different numbers to get her benefits. That's going to work out really well next year, isn't it? Instead of coming up with a rotation system where I have a unified number, even a blinding of the Social Security number. Why do we have Social Security numbers anymore when I could do it, build a chain that actually just gives me a number that's attached to me, but for the outward face is constantly rotating? To the fact that here's my university transcripts, here's my credit, here's the assets I own if I need a quick loan. It's back to my DMV, here's my car, here's my first loan. Walk in, could I do my title loan right off my phone? Here's my proof of who I am walking through the airport. And can I get those all in a place where they go into one location? Instead of the next time when you're trying to get a house loan, you have to come over here and get this document, and then go over here and get this document, and then spend a week chasing down this document. Could you imagine how much easier our lives would be if we could open up one vault door and then choose what bits of information we need? So that's sort of my utopian concept. We have a couple moments. Could we do a couple questions? And then I have one absurdity to throw out. So, anyone? Shoot. And either use a microphone or scream at me. Screaming at me I'm very comfortable with because that's like being at home.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, shoot.
There you go. So what's your theory on having is it going to be interoperability? Is it going to be one blockchain per industry? What's your vision on that?
It's actually a brilliant question. I actually have a weird fixation on node networks. I try not to talk about that out loud because people look at you like you're out of your mind. But I figured this is as good a group as I can. I've actually thought for different types of things, you might actually reach into a different network. So you could actually have a single face. And here's where this comes from. Your home title. Should that actually say, I need this many servers to agree, but I want 51% of those servers to be at the county. Now, I'm from Maricopa County, so I'm from a massive county, 4+ million people. So we could do this there, where those counties have servers that are certified that they do that. But if it's my car title, I just need a third of the to be on state of Arizona, and everyone else could be out in a private network. So you could actually even have, and it's an interesting concept of different levels of confidence on the underlying network and what your rules are. Because there may be some things, look, I'm actually, I'll give you my absurdity. What I'm working on is a little experiment, but because I sit on airplanes a lot. So, yes, sir.
Hi, Mike Hansen, Discover Financial Corp. Regulatory systems and regulators like choke points, things that are regulatable.
Yeah.
What's the smartest thing you've heard anybody say about regulating consensus delivery mechanisms?
It's actually a great question, because where I get the flip side is what happens when that consensus, we all, the code, or if you want to call it smart contract, how it is in the background, all agree that this, because I'm a big advocate for smart contracts. When someone in that background disagrees, the regulators are all going to want to step in and have some way to say, well, I get to be the arbitrator, so I want some level of permission where I can reverse a transaction. Well, then you don't have a true consensus-operated platform. My fear is some regulators really want a level of, you can come, complain to us, we will step in. Well, at that point, you no longer have sort of that frictionless platform. You and I are going to have to come up with some way that the hyper-efficient, it's consensus, or in my world where we've done some writing and some work on broad base of smart contracts with lots of legs on them, and so everything moves seamlessly. But what happens if something goes wrong? Is there a mechanism? And in many ways, that's where I'm most worried about the regulatory world, where, because the next thing they're going to want to do is say, well, I need to slow this down. I need 24 hours for our systems to vet it. Those things. And at that point, then we've blown up all the efficiencies. So it's not a brilliant answer, because it's more I'm just sharing more worries. But I have a crazy idea in the background, would take a little too long, of certain types of transactions. You could give a very high level permission with an adjudication mechanism to at least say, here's the liable parties. But everything else underneath that, you accept sort of a communal agreement. Anyone else? Shoot.
Morning, Kate Rooney from CNBC. So you obviously are very focused on blockchain and some of its regulation.
I often like to say distributive ledger because I like
Distributive ledger.
the elegance of the coding side.
Perfect. But my question is about your colleagues in Congress and maybe on the ways
Let's
and
not
means.
do that.
But what's the tone? What do you hear? Do you think that there's enough of understanding? And what do you think is ahead for regulation?
It's actually, it's a brilliant question. Just yesterday, another gray hair, a member of Congress, ran up to me on the floor and said, David, I just read a book on blockchain. Why didn't you tell me it could do all these things? Look, here's the hard thing. And I'll try to do this quickly. We all have different levels of expertise. I sort of grew up as, I've been a technophile my whole life, so some of this was very comfortable. But we have a member of Congress who has like a PhD in invasive insects. Now, turns out, I thought he wasn't particularly bright because we were having these conversations about derivative contracts a couple years ago. And would you believe he knew nothing about them? And then we hit something about corn futures and the threat of an invasive insect, and he was a genius. There becomes our problem, and this is actually one of the battles you have for even your audiences. You have often very smart viewership. Everyone that would be in this room is freaky smart. You're somewhat self-selected. It sort of goes back to our permission thing, that the fact of the matter that people in this room have chose. But you all have very different backgrounds, or very different technologies. Some people really care about the coding. Some people just care about the outcome. How do I take 435 of us in Congress? I don't need them to understand what a node network is. I just need them, and from my view, I'm trying to sell the societal good that can come from a bulletproof ID, from a bulletproof documentation of ownership, from a bulletproof way to move micro contributions to my IRA. All these things that can happen. And there's this really interesting curve of knowledge where I'm having more members in the last week come up to me excited than I did in the previous couple years. So it's starting. Sorry, long answer, but it's if you're talking about fellow members of Congress, it's always
our last question.
Okay.
Hi, Congressman. My name is Ian. I'm a product manager at Intuit. If you were to talk to a crypto purist, they would say that the point of a blockchain, or one of the reasons, is that we decentralize the administration and the custody of the underlying ledger. And when they hear political leaders such as yourself talk about all the range of public services that could be running on blockchains, they think, well, what you really mean is a centralized ledger that the government is running. So my question for you is, what is the appropriate centralization or decentralization model? And if these were to be decentralized ledgers that are permissionless and public, and they're sort of outside of the political sphere form of governance, then what would be the appropriate governance structure to take custody of these ledgers?
Oh, brilliant. And I need a philosophical paper. You got to understand, I'm probably about at least half libertarian. So I'm excited by, go home, they think I'm an anarchist. So I'm actually very comfortable with something that's very distributive. But there are some things where in our world where the mortgage on your house is going to get bundled into a bond, and that bond is going to be in grandma's retirement account. I'm going to have to figure out some way to make the reps and warrants underneath that for the underlying, that you actually had the right to own that property, the title side, because there's such a other cascade effect through the rest of the world financial market, as we learned in 2008. So that's where the answer over here of sort of, I think there's some things that are absolutely, there's no need for government to be touching that network, the levels of permission. There may be some things where just because it's so integral to if something went wrong, the cascade effects, that might be where, at least I've been working on that idea of nodes that actually have some type of certification to them. So that's less government controlling it, more that we made it that we knew the transaction. Am I making sense?
If I'm hearing you correctly, you're suggesting that the government could make attestations and sort of verify information into these blockchain networks, but that the networks themselves could be a public good. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I'm almost uncomfortable with the term public good, but a private network. So.
Thank you.
And as I'm walking up the stage, on my last couple flights, because when you're in Arizona, you spend a lot of time in an airplane, I've been actually playing with a crazy little idea of a neighborhood babysitting co-op. Don't laugh at me. I have a 2.5-year-old. I'm 56 with a 2.5-year-old. You know I'm pathologically optimistic. But here was the idea. Could I actually sort of take a token, not maybe your type of token, and say, I'm going to have 1,000 of these tokens. I'm going to build an app for a neighborhood co-op that this is my number of values for you babysit my perfect little girl for 2 hours, and you get this much value. In fact, but that's where the idea of sort of these micro networks or small networks where it's my zip code. And yet I have an exchange of value that's moving around under a set of rules that's on an app that once it's issued, but eventually my little girl will become 5 years old and go off, and there'll be a need for another person to step in. I haven't seen a lot in the literature, and I try to read everything I get my hands on these very small loops that also could be really powerful for a community. So if I have anyone freaky smart here who could write that app for me, but you start to think about your car club, your a fishing license, your the ability to have those types of sort of closed groups where you're able to move the documentation of you're owed something or you pledged something. I think it wouldn't be that hard to do. So, hey, thank you for tolerating me. If you have any brilliant ideas, send them to our office so I can take actually credit like it was my idea. Thanks.